Welcome back to the privacy effort. In the next few minutes, I want to walk you through one of the biggest turning points in personal computing today. End of Windows 10 to upgrade to Windows 11. But this isn't just another tech update story. It's about something much deeper: control, cost, and choice. We'll explore three key questions. First, what's really driving Microsoft's push to make millions of computers obsolete? Second, how do the new security features in Windows 11
quietly shift control away from you?
the owner?
And third, what real alternatives do we have? Not just to save money, but to take back autonomy over the devices we already own.
By the end, you'll see how this so-called upgrade reveals a much bigger story, one about privacy,
Ownership, and the path to regain both.
Today I want to talk about why you shouldn't rush to upgrade to Windows 11. I know, Windows 10's end of life is coming up soon. That big deadline everyone's been hearing about is finally here, and a lot of people are starting to feel the pressure to make a move. But before you hit that upgrade button, let's talk about why it is the time to consider another options rather than stick to Microsoft and its Windows. The official end-of-life date for Windows 10 is October 2025. This isn't a simple click and upgrade situation. It's much bigger. This event is pushing users and businesses to confront mass obsolescence, potentially unnecessary spending, and uncomfortable questions about who truly controls the computer on their desk. The analysis we've explored frames it as an enforced hardware upgrade, with an urgency that feels manufactured, built around an arbitrary technological barrier. Windows 10 still runs on a huge chunk of PCs globally, perhaps around 40%. Most of these users, even if they wanted to upgrade to Windows 11, simply can't, or at least not without jumping through significant hoops or potentially violating terms of service. It all comes down to one thing. Microsoft made the TPM 2.0 security chip, the Trusted Platform Module, mandatory. This specific chip is a non-negotiable, hard requirement for Windows 11. If a machine doesn't have it, officially, it's out. The scale of this is staggering, with conservative estimates putting it at 240 million PCs currently running Windows 10 just fine, but lacking that specific TPM 2.0 chip. Microsoft's message is essentially, buy a new computer. This is costly, ranging from $300 on the low end to $2,500 or more for high-end machines or gaming rigs. It's a significant expense pushed onto users, creating a classic dilemma: convenience versus cost and control. Microsoft is effectively telling millions of people to toss perfectly good machines. One description we encountered really hit home. It called the situation Microsoft selling e-waste as software. It's a blunt but accurate capture of the feeling. Not just inconvenient, but an environmental and financial issue. If you decide not to buy new hardware, your only official path is paying for extended security updates, ESU. These updates only last for one more year, after which your machine is completely vulnerable, with no more security patches. So the choice presented is, buy new hardware, pay a temporary fee, or risk it. This is where the uncomfortable feeling creeps in for many users, wondering if Microsoft owns their computer as much as they do, and if they're dictating when personal property becomes obsolete. This feeling, this loss of autonomy and perhaps trust, is precisely why I make this speech. The mission here is about taking back control. My study on this topic include insights from a former Windows developer, someone deep inside that world who put it very plainly: Microsoft has truly gone crazy, and it's time for users to take your freedom back. Strong words indeed. Windows 11 and BitLocker, a case study in loss of control. So today, we're going to explore how you can actually do that, and why Linux, the open-source operating system, might now be the most practical, compelling, and even ethical choice. Linux, the most practical, compelling, and even ethical choice. To truly grasp what's at stake with this ownership question, let's dive into a specific story, a case study that illustrates how Windows 11's default settings can work against you, the owner. This is where security features like BitLocker and the TPM chip stop being abstract ideas and become real instruments of control. Security features become instruments of control. Alex was a colleague of mine at Microsoft about 25 years ago, and he's also a close friend. These days, he runs his own consulting business. In early October 2025, he was setting up a brand new high-end ThinkPad P16VG3 Intel Core Ultra 9285HV Pro laptop. As an experienced user, the first thing he wanted to do was something quite common among power users: install Linux alongside Windows for dual booting, or maybe even replace Windows entirely. A standard first step in that process is to enter the system's UEFI or BIOS settings and turn off Secure Boot. Now here's the catch. On this new Windows 11 machine, BitLocker drive encryption was turned on by default. BitLocker encrypts the entire hard drive for security, often seen as a good thing, and something the user thinks they control. So Alex flipped the switch to disable Secure Boot in the UEFI, and suddenly, the entire hard drive locked up instantly. What went wrong? He discovered later that BitLocker relies heavily on the TPM 2.0 chip to securely store its decryption key. When Secure Boot was turned off, the system saw that change in the boot environment and essentially panicked, interpreting it as a potential security threat. So with the drive locked, how do you even get back in? Where's the recovery key? That's the crucial link in this chain of control. The recovery key was tied to their Microsoft account. Their ability to recover their own data on their own machine depended on logging into Microsoft servers. Alex was forced to spend an entire day wrestling with this, trying different recovery options, navigating dashboards, and realizing he had completely lost control. In the end, he didn't get his data back. The complexity and frustration led him to give up, reformat the entire drive, lose everything, and start from scratch, all because he tried to exercise his right as the owner to install another operating system. The system, BitLocker, actively overrode the owner's decision, treating installing Linux as a threat. This story is deeply unsettling. It shows that BitLocker, pitched as security for you, is fundamentally tied to Microsoft's control, not your autonomy. It perfectly frames the core question. If buying new hardware doesn't even guarantee full ownership, if just changing basic settings risks locking you out and losing data, forcing you to rely on a third-party company for recovery, what's the real alternative? How do you actually take back control? The answer, I suggest, is getting out of that closed system altogether, which brings us to Linux. Why do millions, maybe billions, of people stick with Windows despite its problems? Let's explore the powerful psychology at play. We've all seen the red flags: security issues, potential costs, and control problems associated with Windows. The biggest factor is probably comfort, the comfort of the familiar, like an old habit. Many grew up with Windows. Their computing muscle memory is Microsoft-defined. It feels easy, predictable. Beyond habit, there's also the fear of losing essential tools, the software barrier. That's probably the #1 reason people hesitate. We are often deeply reliant on specific, proprietary, industry-standard software that just doesn't run easily, or maybe at all, on Linux. It's not just about comfort. It feels like a threat to one's job, studies, or creative work. My studying points to 3 main categories where people hit this psychological or professional wall. First, the Microsoft Office suite: Word, Excel, PowerPoint, the big 3. Running the full desktop versions natively on Linux is almost impossible without using compatibility layers, which can be fiddly. While web versions like Office 365 Online work fine, if you're in a complex collaborative environment dealing with advanced Excel macros or intricate track changes in Word documents shared with Windows users, then open-source alternatives like LibreOffice might cause subtle incompatibilities that can break workflows, which is a legitimate concern. The second category is creative and CAD software, often the toughest hurdle. Think Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, or industrial design tools like AutoCAD, SolidWorks. None of these run on Linux natively. While there are excellent open-source alternatives like GIMP for image editing, or web-based options like Onshape for CAD, it's not always a perfect substitute, especially for professionals dealing with specific client file formats, or if their entire industry runs on Adobe or Autodesk. Finding a true one-to-one replacement for these complex established workflows is genuinely difficult. You're fighting decades of industry momentum. The third category is proprietary development tools, specifically the full Visual Studio IDE from Microsoft, the big environment for building Windows apps, C#.NET. While VS Code, the lighter editor, runs everywhere, the full-fat Visual Studio IDE does not run on Linux. For developers deep in that specific Microsoft ecosystem, that's a major roadblock. Though alternatives like JetBrains Rider do exist, and are excellent. These software barriers lead straight into that general perception of difficulty, the fear that Linux is just hard. The fear of a steep learning curve makes people worry they'll be constantly troubleshooting, fixing things, or maybe even getting sucked into distro hopping, constantly switching between different versions or distributions of Linux, trying to find the perfect one instead of just getting work done, turning the OS itself into a hobby, which nobody has time for. This fear is understandable, especially if their only image of Linux comes from 10 or 20 years ago, when installing stuff could mean compiling code from the command line. That's largely gone now, but the perception lingers. So the status quo often feels safer. People think, Windows works with everything, everyone uses it, it must be better, even while admitting it feels bloated or slow. Sticking with what you know feels less risky, even if you know you're giving up some privacy or paying more long-term. Windows control script, forced identity, hardware tracking, and the AI agenda. Now let's get into Act 2, where we detail the specific ways Windows works against you, the mechanics of control, and how Linux offers solutions. Let's start with something called the Windows control script. What are the red flags? The first major one is what we could call forced identity, meaning you have to have a Microsoft account. It's become incredibly difficult, almost intentionally impossible, to install Windows 11 without creating or logging in to a Microsoft ID, because it immediately links your specific computer, your physical hardware, to your personal identity. It ties you directly into their entire cloud ecosystem. If privacy matters to you, this forced login is a non-starter. Your usage, your apps, telemetry data, it's all potentially logged and linked back to you via that account. The hardware itself plays a role in this tracking, bringing us back to the TPM chip. This is the TPM 2.0 identity tracker, the second red flag. But crucially, every single TPM chip has a unique, permanent identifier built into it, an endorsement key, like a serial number or an IMEI on your phone. It's a hardware fingerprint, and Microsoft knows this fingerprint. It gets associated with your Microsoft ID during setup, so they know this specific device is linked to your specific account. So other companies could potentially query your machine's unique ID. The implication is that the TPM isn't just a security feature for you. It's a permanent hardware identifier that facilitates tracking and linking your identity to that specific piece of metal. So we have forced identity linking and hardware-level tracking. Where does this lead? What's the bigger picture here? It points towards something called the AI agenda, the ultimate goal. Microsoft is pushing very hard towards creating an all-encompassing AI companion, something that's always there, always watching, always learning from you through Copilot and related features. But to be truly effective, this AI needs to know everything you do on your computer. It needs a perfect record of your activity. And that leads to features like Windows Recall. Windows Recall is a key part of these new Copilot Plus PCs. It works by essentially taking screenshots of your screen every few seconds, constantly, building a complete searchable visual history. Building a complete searchable visual history of almost everything you've ever done, seen, or typed on your computer. Stored locally on your hard drive. That sounds like a massive privacy risk, having your entire digital life recorded like that. And here's the twist. The source material argues that all those complex security features Windows 11 requires, the TPM, secure boot, mandatory BitLocker encryption, become necessary not just to protect your data, but to protect Microsoft's data about you. Now that this incredibly sensitive recall history exists on your drive, the security measures are there to lock down the surveillance data they're collecting. It's a profound irony, isn't it? You're forced into this complex security setup, partly to safeguard the comprehensive record of your life that the OS itself is creating. It protects their asset, the data about you, while reducing your actual control. Beyond the big privacy picture, what about just the daily headaches, the practical stuff? That brings us to the third red flag, the update catastrophe. Everyone who's used Windows recently knows the pain of forced Windows updates. Updates are forced. You can usually only delay them for a short period, maybe 2 weeks, depending on your version. They always seem to happen at the worst possible time. And worse, they're notorious for causing huge, unexpected problems. Things break, settings change, and critically for people trying to escape, they can mess up dual booting. Forced Windows updates are infamous for overriding bootloader instructions, making your Linux partition completely inaccessible without manual repair. It's like Windows actively fights coexistence. Plus, the forced restarts mean unplanned downtime, which is terrible for productivity. Even if you're just managing disks within Windows, it's hostile to other systems. That's the fourth red flag, the danger of Windows Disk Management, the built-in tool for partitioning drives. If you have a Linux partition on your drive, typically formatted with something like ext4, Windows Disk Management just won't recognize it properly. It doesn't know how to read it. So it might label that space as unallocated or raw. The real danger is that it might let you click a button to format or delete that empty space without giving you a clear, strong warning that you're about to wipe out your entire Linux installation and all its data. So it actively makes it easy to accidentally destroy your other operating system. It feels like a deliberate design choice to discourage or punish users for trying to use anything else, making dual booting fragile. That's a pretty damning picture of the Windows control script. Let's immediately pivot to the positive side. Act 2, Part B, the Linux liberation mechanics. What are the concrete advantages of switching? Let's start with money, or total cost of ownership, TCO. Because Linux being free is only part of the story, especially for businesses. TCO looks at the whole picture: software costs, hardware costs, administration, maintenance, downtime, everything over several years. How does Linux stack up against Windows in a real-world scenario? An extensive study cited in the research modeled a typical organization of 250 staff using computers over a 3-year period. They compared the full Microsoft stack against a standard Linux solution, using existing hardware for the Linux side in one scenario, hardware that might have been deemed too old for Windows 11. The numbers are striking. The total cost for the Microsoft solution over 3 years came out to just over $1 million, $1,066,712 to be exact. A significant chunk of change for a medium-sized business. Now the standard Linux solution, using that existing hardware, had a total cost of $682,090. That's a huge difference. A saving of 36%, over $384,000, saved in just 3 years for this 250-person company. And that wasn't just the initial license cost. It came from lower admin overhead, less need for powerful hardware, and eliminating ongoing license fees or software assurance costs. Even when they modeled an enterprise Linux solution using paid support like Red Hat and buying new hardware, Linux still came out 26% cheaper, saving $345,000. The cost argument seems incredibly strong, especially for organizations. And get this, that TCO model was actually quite favorable to Microsoft. It excluded several key costs where Windows typically fares much worse. Like what? It didn't factor in costs from unexpected downtime or system crashes. Linux is generally far more stable, requires fewer reboots, which means less lost productivity and less admin time spent fixing things. Okay, stability saves money. What else was excluded? The big one: malware and virus costs. The sources bluntly state that malware cleanup, ransomware, and data breaches are essentially and predominantly a Windows platform cost. Businesses lose billions every year due to Windows security issues. Linux, with its different architecture and permission model, is inherently less vulnerable to most of that ecosystem. Factoring that in would make the TCO savings even more dramatic. So the financial case is compelling. What about the user experience? Linux used to have a reputation for being tricky to install software on. But the old days of needing to compile things from source code using the command line are long gone for most users. Installation is often easier and more reliable than Windows in many cases, thanks mainly to modern packaging formats like Flatpak and Snap. Flatpak is like a universal app store for Linux. A Flatpak package bundles the application and all the little libraries and dependencies it needs to run, all together in one neat container. So you don't have to worry if your specific Linux version has the right support files. You download the Flatpak, install it with one click in a graphical software center, and it just works consistently across different Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, or Mint, solving that fragmentation problem. In Linux Mint, the Flatpak functionality is already integrated into the default Software Manager application. What kind of software is available this way? Not just obscure open source stuff. Major popular applications that people use every day are available as Flatpaks. We're talking Steam for gaming. Absolutely. Steam runs great on Linux now, largely thanks to Valve. Also Discord, Zoom, Slack, Spotify, Chrome, Firefox, VS Code, tons of mainstream applications. Installation is often click and go, just like on Windows, or even simpler, because it's centralized. Okay, installation is easier. What about updates and general reliability day-to-day compared to the Windows Update nightmare? This is where Linux really shines. New users often describe the Linux update process as, well, delightful. That's not a word usually associated with OS updates, right? Because Linux updates almost never force you to stop what you're doing. They don't steal focus. They don't pop up demanding restarts in the middle of your work. They just happen in the background, mostly. The system updates itself. Your Flatpak apps update themselves, often seamlessly. And crucially, they almost never require a mandatory reboot, maybe for a major kernel update, but not for everyday stuff. So you can just keep working. High uptime is normal. People often go months without needing to restart their Linux machines. It's stable, reliable, and respects your time. Contrast that with Windows forcing a reboot after installing a printer driver. Point taken. Finally, that massive e-waste problem Microsoft created with Windows 10's end of life. How does Linux address hardware longevity? It solves it instantly. Remember those 240 million PCs deemed obsolete by Windows 11's TPM requirement? Destined for the landfill, basically. Well, a typical modern user-friendly Linux distribution like Linux Mint, specifically designed to feel familiar to Windows users, has incredibly light requirements. How light? It only needs about 2 gigabytes of RAM and 20 gigabytes of disk space to run smoothly. 2 gigs of RAM. That's ancient by today's standards. Exactly. It means Linux Mint, which is totally free, can run beautifully on almost all of those 240 million machines that Microsoft declared obsolete. So instead of throwing away a perfectly good computer, you install Linux, give it a whole new lease on life, save yourself hundreds or thousands of dollars, and prevent perfectly good hardware from becoming e-waste. It's a win-win-win. Okay, we've laid out the problems with Windows, the control script, and the liberation mechanics of Linux: cost, usability, longevity. Now let's get really practical. 3 memorable, actionable counter-strategies for anyone thinking about making the switch. These are designed to tackle those financial and psychological barriers head-on. Let's start with Rule 1. Stop buying e-waste. Embrace longevity. This is the immediate financial and environmental payoff. By installing Linux, you can keep using your current Windows 10 PC perfectly well long after Microsoft cuts off support, instantly saving you the cost of a new machine, anywhere from $300 to $2,500 plus. That's the immediate saving, but the long-term saving is just as important. Remember those ongoing Windows costs? Licensing, yes, but also things like software assurance for businesses. Software assurance is basically a subscription businesses pay on top of the license, costing 25% to 29% of the original purchase price every single year just to get upgrades and certain support benefits. It adds up incredibly fast. So a $1,000 Windows license could cost an extra $290 annually just to maintain. Precisely. With Linux, the software is typically free. Migration might have some one-time costs, maybe some setup time, maybe a little training, but they don't compound year after year. A Dutch government study found that migrating to open-source productivity software was 90% less expensive over the long run compared to just upgrading the existing Microsoft platform. The savings are real and sustained. Okay, Rule 1 saves money and hardware. What's Rule 2? Adopt the ecosystem, not the clone. This tackles the software compatibility anxiety, meaning don't expect Linux to magically run all your Windows programs. Exactly. Let go of the idea that you need to run Photoshop or the full desktop Microsoft Office directly on Linux. That way lies frustration. Instead, embrace the FOSS ecosystem. FOSS stands for Free and Open Source Software. Free as in cost, and open source meaning the code is public. Yes, free to use, modify, share, and the code being open means it can be audited for security and approved by a global community. So you look for the FOSS equivalents for your needs, like LibreOffice or OpenOffice instead of Microsoft Office, GIMP instead of Photoshop, Brave, Firefox, or Thunderbird instead of Edge or Outlook, Kdevelop or other IDEs instead of Visual Studio, Apache for web servers, MySQL or Postgres for databases. There's a mature FOSS alternative for almost every category. But what about those situations where you absolutely need a specific Windows program, like that specialized CAD software, or maybe a music production, VST software, that only comes for Windows? That's where you use targeted solutions. Don't compromise your whole system. First, check if a web app version exists. Microsoft 365 Online is surprisingly capable. Onshape is a powerful web-based CAD tool. And if a web app won't cut it, then you use a virtual machine, VM. Install a lightweight VM program like VirtualBox, get a cheap Windows license if you need one, and run just that one specific program inside the VM, isolated from your main Linux system. So you contain the proprietary software to a little box without giving it control of your main OS. Exactly. It handles those niche edge cases without sacrificing the overall benefits of control, privacy, and cost savings on your primary Linux setup. Okay, great strategy. What's the final rule? Rule 3. Accept the difference. This tackles the fear of the learning curve, the idea that Linux is just too hard or too different to learn. Right. And the truth is, Linux is different from Windows. It works differently. It thinks differently sometimes. Rule 3 is about acknowledging that and adjusting your mindset. Don't try to force Linux to be a perfect Windows clone. You'll just get frustrated. Instead, adopt a growth mindset. Accept that you'll be a beginner again, just for a little while. Be curious. Be willing to learn a few new ways of doing things. But how long does that beginner phase really last? Is it months of struggle? That's the surprising part. The data we looked at is really encouraging. Studies on first-time Linux users found something remarkable. 1 week. That's it. That's what the studies suggest. The biggest hurdle isn't complexity. It's just unfamiliarity. Once you get past that initial where is everything feeling, which happens quickly, you find it's actually very logical and efficient. And you don't have to become a command line wizard, right? Absolutely not. While the command line is still there and incredibly powerful for those who want it for speed, scripting, and reproducibility, it's not mandatory for everyday use anymore. Modern Linux desktops have graphical interfaces, software stores. Totally. You can manage software installs, system settings, files, everything through a familiar point-and-click graphical interface, just like on Windows or Mac OS. The command line is an option, a powerful one, but not a requirement to get started. So embrace longevity, adopt the ecosystem, accept the difference. 3 solid rules. Beyond personal benefits, Linux's impact on family and community. Now, we focus a lot on the individual benefits, cost, control, privacy. But let's step back and look at the bigger picture, the family and community side. Yes, absolutely. Switching to Linux isn't just a personal tech choice. It can be seen as contributing to broader societal and environmental goals. Let's start with the environment. We mentioned e-waste earlier. That's right, the environmental mandate. When Microsoft effectively forces the obsolescence of hundreds of millions of perfectly functional computers, like those Windows 10 machines, that has a massive environmental impact. Where do all those old computers go? Landfills, often. Where the materials break down slowly, organic components can produce methane, a really potent greenhouse gas. And think about the other side. Manufacturing replacements requires enormous amounts of energy and resources, mining rare earth metals, transportation, and fabrication. So just by not throwing away your old PC and installing Linux instead, you are taking a direct, tangible step to reduce e-waste, conserve resources, and lower carbon emissions. It's a simple action with a real environmental benefit. What about the social and economic side? How does migrating to open source help the community? There are several key benefits highlighted in my studying. First, it curbs cash outflow. Money that once left the community for software giants now stays local. That same money fuels small businesses, supports local IT talent, and strengthens the economy from within. Businesses might spring up offering Linux support, customization, or training, and it encourages local talent. Yes, it helps nurture local software development. Because the source code for Linux and FOSS applications is open, it's a fantastic learning tool. It can encourage a higher level of programming skill within the community. People can learn by reading, modifying, and contributing to real-world code. So it builds local capacity. It does. And fundamentally, it helps release society from the locked-in control of one dominant foreign company. It promotes technological sovereignty and choice. So it's about individual freedom and collective empowerment. That's a great way to put it. It's a choice with ripple effects beyond just your own desktop. Windows to Linux, a transformation to liberated control. This whole deep dive really comes back to that core theme, doesn't it? Control, identity, privacy. Making the switch from Windows to Linux feels like a kind of transformation. It really is. You move from being maybe a passive consumer, a subject of planned obsolescence. Someone even used the term Microsoft slave, harsh, but it captures the feeling of lack of control. Right. And you transform into something else. The liberated user. Someone who actively chooses control, values hardware longevity, prioritizes privacy, and cares about sustainability. Maybe more than just mandated convenience. It's taking an active stance. Exactly. And the final provocation, the thing that really ties all the threads together, goes back to that AI agenda we discussed. Windows recall, the constant screen recording. Yes. Remember, the argument is that the core design goal driving Windows 11, Copilot, and these new PCs is the complete, continual recording of your digital life stored on your hard drive. And the security features required for that TPM, BitLocker tied to Microsoft ID, are the very things that limit your control. Precisely. They are the mechanisms of control, ostensibly there to protect the data they're collecting about you. So choosing Linux becomes more than just picking a different OS. It's an active vote against that entire architecture of surveillance and control. It's a refusal to have your life documented minute by minute just to boot your computer. Okay, so the case is clear. The risk seems low. Linux itself is free, after all. The potential upside, control, privacy, sustainability, saving potentially thousands of dollars, is huge. What's the absolute first concrete step someone watching right now can take without, nuking their current setup? That's the beauty of it. The barrier to just trying Linux is practically zero these days. There are a couple of really easy, low-risk ways to dip your toes in the water. First, install it in a virtual machine, VM. Grab free VM software like VirtualBox or VMware Player. Download an ISO file for a user-friendly Linux version like Linux Mint or Ubuntu. An ISO file is the installer image, like the installation disk, but as a file. You load that ISO into the VM software, and you can install and run Linux entirely inside a window on your current Windows desktop. So it doesn't touch your main system at all, not one bit. It's completely sandboxed. A great way to just play around, get a feel for the interface, and see what software is available. Okay, VMs are one option. What's another? Even better for seeing how it runs on your actual hardware is creating a bootable USB drive, running Linux right off a USB stick. Exactly. There are super easy tools now, like Ventoy or Rufus. You use them to put the Linux ISO file onto a USB drive. Then you just restart your computer, tell it to boot from the USB stick instead of the hard drive, and it loads Linux without installing anything. It runs entirely from the USB drive and your computer's RAM. It's called a live session. You can connect to Wi-Fi, browse the web, test out applications, see if your printer works, all without making any changes to your hard drive. When you shut down and remove the USB, your computer boots back into Windows like nothing happened. That sounds incredibly easy. Test drive it on your real hardware, zero commitment. It's the perfect way to start. And if you decide you like it, most live sessions have an install icon right on the desktop to begin the actual installation process if you choose. Okay, so VM or bootable USB. Any advice on which Linux to try? There are so many names. Ubuntu, Mint, Fedora, Debian? Good question. For beginners, especially coming from Windows, the advice is usually to stick with one of the major user-friendly distributions, like Ubuntu or Linux Mint. Exactly. Ubuntu, Linux Mint, pop_os, maybe Fedora. These have huge user bases, which means tons of online tutorials, forums for help, excellent documentation, and generally very polished, easy-to-use desktop interfaces. Mint is often specifically recommended for Windows switchers because it has a very familiar layout. So pick a popular one for support and ease of use, right? Don't get bogged down in distro hopping at first. Just pick one. Try it out via USB or VM. It really does feel like it's time. Time to reclaim your hardware, reclaim your freedom. If those 240 million obsolete machines can run Linux perfectly, maybe yours can too. Maybe it's time for a new life for your PC. Absolutely. And here's a final thought to maybe chew on until our next deep dive. If we accept that the trajectory of mainstream OS like Windows is towards constant monitoring, like recall, to feed AI, and that access requires you to give up hardware control and tie your security keys to the cloud, what small actions are you taking every day, maybe unintentionally, that signal your consent to that model. Just thinking about that might be the nudge you need to download that Linux Mint ISO tonight and grab a USB stick. Let's take a moment to look back at what we've covered today. We started with that big question hanging over millions of computer users right now. Should you really upgrade to Windows 11? And we discovered that this isn't just a technical issue. It's a question about control, cost, and choice. We saw how Microsoft's mandatory TPM 2.0 chip and forced account requirements are more than just security measures. They quietly reshape ownership, linking your hardware, your identity, and even your data back to Microsoft's ecosystem. We explored how this upgrade cycle pushes massive e-waste, forcing people to replace perfectly good machines, and how that decision has real financial and environmental costs. Then, we turned the conversation around, from frustration to freedom. We looked at how Linux and open-source software offer a real alternative, one that's cost-effective, stable, private, and able to give new life to your existing computer. And we wrapped it into 3 simple, actionable ideas. Stop buying e-waste and embrace longevity. Adopt the ecosystem, not the clone. And accept the difference. Learn, adapt, and take control. So if there's one takeaway from today, it's this. You don't have to follow the upgrade treadmill. You can keep your computer, keep your freedom, and choose a system that truly works for you.
Fantastic food for thought indeed. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. That wraps up today's discussion. Thanks for watching and tuning in. If you're curious to dive deeper into this topic, make sure to visit our website. The link is in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.